then, of course, there was the other Christmas TV tradition. Usually a couple of weeks before the big day itself, as the Christmas trailers started to increase in frequency toward fever pitch, the shelves of your local newsagents would be graced with the double-sized Christmas and usually New Year edition of the Radio Times. Your indispensable guide to that year's festive entertainment, or occasionally lack thereof. That was when we knew the countdown had truly begun, that Christmas was so close we could almost taste it. The fortnight or so between the magazine's release and the big event was spent obsessively poring through the thing, marvelling at the often highly intricate illustrations that decorated the listings for the important days, checking which presenters would be on children's BBC duty, and what time the snowman would be on this year. Christmas was and is a massive undertaking every year. And every year, your official Hayes manual is the Radio Times. The Radio Times, as it was officially called for its first 14 years, was launched in 1923 as the official organ of the BBC. That's right, 1923, actually predating the BBC as we know it today by 5 years. The BBC that published the very earliest Radio Times issues was in fact the British Broadcasting Company, Lord Reith's progenitor to the modern-day corporation. The other major thing it predated, of course, was television, or more accurately, any sort of television network. Instead, it provided precisely what the title implied: the Radio Times, alongside news and statements from the nascent broadcasting world in the format of a broadsheet paper. Most issues were black and white and full of words, like the very first one seen here. But for the very first Christmas number, to use the terminology at the time, the company indulged themselves with the Radio Times' very first fully painted cover. Just a Song at Twilight, with the classic post-Edwardian British family unit: kindly dad backed with pipe, devoted mother, fragrant daughter, ruddy-cheeked sons, all gathered around the gramophone. This kind of imagery of an idealised past is still popular at Christmas today. Even Quality Street still deploy the soldier and the lady at times. Which means it takes a minor but real effort to remind yourself that this isn't imagery of an idealised past, this is contemporary to the magazine itself, a no less idealised present that we, the tasteless idiots in the future, have made timeless by turning it into kitsch. Something of a backhanded compliment to the past, really. But at least we meant well, I think. The following year, 1924, saw arguably the first truly iconic Radio Times Christmas cover. The image of a somewhat less formal and, dare I say, lower class Christmas get-together, attended for some reason by Laurel and Hardy, has been much imitated over the years, not least by the Radio Times itself, as we'll see later on. 1925 completed a sort of conceptual trilogy with this jazz-age flapper Christmas in excelsis, featuring a cameo for the guy with the cigarette from the previous year. All of these first 3 Radio Times Christmas covers were painted by the same person, known only as Abby. The rest of their identity sadly lost to time. But after 3 years, he or she moved on, or died, or was abducted by aliens. And 1926's striking cover was painted by the legendary American-born futurist Edward McKnight Kauffer. And yes, in retrospect it does resemble some sort of fascist propaganda poster about the burning of the Reichstag. But that's not Calver's fault, particularly since it hadn't happened yet. The hiring of the eminent poster artist was the beginning of a marked shift away from Abbey's orthodox depictions of basic Christmas tableau and towards the then fashionable end of the art spectrum. Elements like abstract representationalism, angular vorticist lines, bold, futurist colours. All these and more were present, take my word for it, on the 1927 cover, again by Calver. More things are happening in this than you realise, as Calver layers the image in such a way that multiple optical illusions are going off in your head without you necessarily noticing. 1928's cover is less dynamic, but that's not a criticism. Painted by someone known only as Stanford, it combines the star, announcing the birth of Mr. Jesus R. Christ, with a radio signal, which would have been a far more effective way of summoning the Magi had it been invented yet. The star was also the subject of 1929's cover by Shep, albeit in a much more abstract, less literal form, and shining on some sort of grapefruit rather than a nativity scene. In 1930, the Radio Times made a return to something resembling realism, hiring Cornish engraver Claude Pellew to provide an insanely detailed image of carolers in his Len hometown of Trunch, which must have taken bloody ages to do, because somehow Pellew manages to combine wood carving and pointillism. He must have had the patience of 10 Nick Parks. 1931 saw a bit of Baroque revivalist styles, courtesy of no less than Rex Whistler, no relation to James McNeill, as he would wearily explain in a monotone. Of course, Naked Cherubim were all very well between the wars, but a cover like this now would have the Daily Mail campaigning to get the entire BBC outlawed, even though they don't even make the Radio Times anymore. 1932's cover, provided by Edward Ardizone, was less ornate, but arguably even more like the front of some Charles Gardnerov hardback. The sort of thing that was full of short stories and doggerel and brain teasers. The kind of thing that used to show up in your grandparents' stockings. 1933 saw a return to the modernist school, with S.C. Johnson providing a dramatic, if not massively Christmassy, image of some snowbound radio masts and a positively icy broadcasting house. 1934 brought a surfeit of Magi atop some distinctly unimpressed looking camels. Mind you, camels always look like that. In 1935, the Radio Times hired the famed poster artist of the London Underground and family roadster, Austin Cooper, who turned in what appears to be a highly stylised rendition of Mr. Bean Natural. 1936's cover was the last one to include the definite article, and it depicted a toy room. The gollywog is sad because he knows that, although in and of himself and devoid of all context he is essentially harmless, he is nonetheless based on a crude, racist caricature, and therefore will have increasingly little place in polite Western society as the century goes on. This year, for the first time, there are also television listings to go with the radio ones, albeit very few and very limited. 1937 gave us a very slightly impressionistic sketch of a family going to a church service, which probably represents the first time that Edwardian imagery was used for nostalgic purposes rather than contemporary illustration, even if it's less retro than it looks from here. 1938's cover by Seawater Hodges does much the same, with its picture of some horse-drawn trees. Well done on Mr. Hodges for figuring out a way to include his name twice. In fact, it's just as well he did go to so much trouble with this cover, because it's the last time the Christmas Radio Times would look quite this opulent for almost a quarter of a century. It's also the last time that television listings would appear for several years, for the same reason. As I'm sure you're aware, in 1939, a bit of a war broke out. The effects are immediately obvious on 1939's Christmas Radio Times cover. Suddenly, ink is at a premium. Coloured ink in particular could scarcely be justified for something as frivolous as radio listings, apart from the odd splash of red, because that's easy to manufacture. Just squish a beetle or two. The following year's Christmas cover at least tried to be light-hearted about the situation, but I doubt it was as comforting an image as it wanted to be, with the rest of Europe already fallen and invasion looking imminent. As the war dragged on, even the colour red started to disappear. First it was relegated to mastheads and headlines only, then even that dried up.
Will Santa Claus wear a tin helmet when he visits the girls and the boys? Will Santa Claus wear a tin helmet when he comes to deliver his toys? To get down the chimney will be quite a task, but there is the question that I'd like to ask. Will his big whiskers go in his little gas mask? Will Santa Claus wear a tin hat?
On and on it went, well after the war had ended. It wasn't until 1957 that coloured ink finally made a comeback, and even then, initially only the red stuff. Consequently, the next several years saw a lot of red-dominated covers, all the way into the early 60s. Such was the Second World War's impact on the world's ink resources. Truly, the evil of the Nazis knew no bounds. The rest of the year was largely black and white. Breaking out the cochineal was very much a Christmas treat. These covers look quite solemn to our eyes, but to the readers at the time, they were festive by comparison. Finally, in 1963, full colour returned, alongside the semi-iconic Kenny High Street / Mary Quant Clarendon logo. Also returning was the influence of modern art, with this expressionist and slightly cubist image of what appears to be some sort of angel carrying a mobile or something, I'm honestly not sure. And that sort of tastefully cubist angularity would continue to inform the Radio Times Christmas covers for the next couple of years. 1964's depicted some sort of circular stained glass window, I expect, while in 1965 we were treated to Sugar Plum Fairy descending a staircase. This one also kicked off a brief trend of having the masthead say Christmas Radio Times, in case we weren't sure. The pointiness continued in 1966 with a cover that was a little bit Mondrian, a little bit Picasso, and a little bit L.S. Lowry. Well, I thought so anyway. And I've got an art degree, so you just bloody well take my word for it. 1967 gave us a sculptural type thing that was very faintly psychedelic, but ultimately straight-laced enough for plausible deniability. Technically, this represents the first use of a photograph rather than a painting or drawing, But the first true photographic cover as we understand the phrase today came the following year. It was also the first cover to be themed around the specific contents within, rather than the season in general, with its bauble festooned with a galaxy of 1968 vintage stars, including Ken Dodd, Omar Sharif, Benny Hill, Leslie Crowther and the late Cilla Black, known the chief clown from the Psychic Circus. Now that's what I call properly late 60s. And I don't just mean the faces, I mean the whole design. From the colour to even the lettering on the baubles, it bellows its year of creation through a great big metaphorical loudspeaker. This year also brought to an end the brief trend of calling the magazine Christmas Radio Times, because in 1969 the magazine adopted their most endearing logo, the flowing, ultra-sophisticated serifs of Caslon, initially with the outsized R and T, that came to define the Radio Times look and feel. Classy as all hell, even with this on the cover. Or indeed this. Faintly similar to last year's, but less organised, dotted with the severed heads of various TV and radio stars, of whom Elvis appears to be their god. This cover also stood vanguard at the birth of a dynasty of sorts, because 1969's was the very first Christmas and New Year double issue, which is now of course a fat Christmas fixture every year. The design might be kitsch bordering on satirically camp, but that's Christmas for you. Besides, you should make the most of it, because this is the last Christmas Radio Times in a good few years to have any sort of illustration or graphic design elements by the logo on the cover at all, as the combination of the magazine's increasing facility with photographs, the rise of thick glossy paper covers, and an increasing populism that they've long since ceased actually fighting, led to a wave of photographic celeb-drenched covers instead. See? 1970s cover depicts a Christmas party with Morecambe and Wise, of course, at the forefront. The following year was the turn of the two Ronnies, apparently out carolling, and of course using for retro camp purposes imagery that in the early years of the magazine were twice as contemporary as Rudolph wearing an Apple Watch would be today. In 1972, Eric and Ernie took their turn again, under a newly puffed out logo and alongside some stars of Billy Smart's Circus, a Christmas fixture in a very different world. Once a staple of BBC One's Christmas afternoon, Billy and company eventually moved to a markedly unenthusiastic ITV in the 80s, where they eventually withered on the post-Boxing Day vine. In 1973, the inevitable happened and both double acts appeared simultaneously on the cover, joining forces in a quadruple act of unknowable power. Only for the photograph though, they never did a joint Christmas special or anything. Fatigue had clearly set in by 1974, and that year's Christmas cover represents some sort of nadir. Michael Crawford as Frank Spencer, on a pink background, doing a JNT point at half a Christmas cracker. He's not even dressed for the season, unless that's a festive brown tank top, and if it is, they've cropped out everything Christmassy about it. Perhaps realising they could put Frank Spencer on the cover any time of year, and indeed frequently did, 1975 saw a return to old ways, with this sort of painted collage styles. Bit busy, but undoubtedly Christmassy. 1976 gave us a stained glass window on which... Is this part of the Christmas story? Because I don't remember... Oh my god, it's David Cameron! Someone save that pig! The punk revolution of 1977 resolutely failed to have any effect on that year's Christmas Radio Times, which went with a sort of Rubens Vase Christmas tree / village effect. Let that dog in, someone. 1978 saw a temporary return to photographic covers, with this frankly terrifying shot of a boggle-eyed Mike Yarwood in a massive black void gawping hungrily out of the picture plane. You wouldn't want that on your coffee table for 2 seconds, let alone 2 weeks. The last Christmas of the decade saw more Edwardian nostalgia, at least judging from the OXO advert in the background. Meanwhile, in the foreground, some urchins make the most half-assed Father Christmas snowman in history. The first Christmas of the 80s was graced with this charming tableau, which, to my mind, has a faint, and by no means unpleasant, whiff of the Low Countries about it, with the lean Clare art style and the vaguely Dutch costumes and the inexplicably Belgian decor. Possibly, instead of the baby Jesus, the manger is occupied by a miniature version of the mannequin Peas. I don't have a copy at sufficient resolution to confirm or deny this. 1981 had just the one turtle dove at the centre of some sort of disturbing avian orgy, standing atop a bell. Peace on earth, goodwill to all men. The explicitly religious iconography had been slowly degrading from the 60s through the 70s, much to the chagrin of the now ancient Lord Wreath. With Wreath now 10 years dead, the 80s would see secular imagery pretty much cement its place. 1982 had a tribute to I Saw Three Ships, a song which I always thought was only ever tangentially related to Christmas in the first place. Presumably the Virgin Mary and Christ are on one of the other two, because figurehead aside, this one's largely overloaded with, again, secular business, including a bizarre collection of flags. Guess which nation in the UK the artists come from? 1983 is my birth year, in case you care, which would frankly astonish me. My first Christmas was graced with an unsettling festive Rorschach based on the 12 Days of Christmas. The artist, impossibly enough, has somehow managed to make the image almost seem symmetrical, despite that being theoretically impossible. There's only a couple of really noticeable exceptions, most egregiously this extraneous Lord a-leaping here. Get out of shot, kid. The optical illusion theme continued in 1984 with one of my favourites, a brilliantly rendered slice of seasonal pareidolia that's worth just staring at for a few seconds until you've figured out what all the things you're looking at actually are. Photographic covers were back in 1985 with the cast of Only Fools and Horses. Points off for the unseasonal breakfast TV coloured background, but points back on for dressing Buster Merryfield as Father Christmas, since he already looked like him anyway. There was a photo again in 1986, this time featuring the corporation's biggest new-ish show, The Stenders. In the year it first became the depressing Yuletide fixture it is to this day, when Den served Angie with divorce papers for Christmas. My little sister was born in 1987, and the Radio Times celebrated with some more strangely Dutch-looking children, this time swapping the lean Clare styles from the top of the decade for a more ornate Bruegel sort of feel. The girl bears almost but not quite no resemblance whatsoever to my sister, incidentally. 1988 is one of my favourite years, not because of anything that happened in it, because nothing particularly special did, but simply because it's so symmetrical to look at. That year's Christmas Radio Times took as its theme the grand British tradition of pantomime. The image depicts some sort of pantomime crossover event, with all the joy and terror that implies. Present are Dick Whittington, Puss in Boots, Cinderella Sisters, Tinkerbell, Wishy Washy, and a random Harlequin, among others. Oh, what fun. The decade closed with what remains the last photographic cover to date, as well as the last to use exclusively religious imagery. Carols from Kings is on every year on Christmas Eve, usually on BBC Two. Why it got promoted to front cover duty I'm not sure, although it's tempting to conclude that there was simply nothing else on that year. A quick glance at the contents via the BBC Genome website lends credence to the theory. Into the 90s. The 1990s cover kicks off a vogue for well-rendered chocolate box images of Mr. K. Kringle, Esquire. It's impressively lush and detailed, but I'm not sure about the artist's facility with faces. I mean, what's this kid done to the mince pies? And as for Father Christmas himself, he just doesn't seem wholesome.
The Care Bears.
Moving on. 1991 is one of the first Christmas radio times that I can actually remember clearly. Partly that's because of its cover conceit that Father Christmas there is actually reading the issue that he was appearing on the front of while appearing on the front of it, which blew my tiny mind. But also because this was the biggest Radio Times ever up to that point, being as it was the first double issue since the deregulation of TV listings. Before March 1991 there were two listings magazines, both affiliated with the companies themselves. The BBC put out Radio Times, with the listings for their channels and their radio stations. And the IBA oversaw, albeit rather more distantly, the TV Times, which covered ITV and, after 1982, Channel 4. With the rise of satellite and cable, this was becoming an increasingly pointless and restrictive setup, so after 1991 the gates were thrown open. Both the radio and TV Times started printing everybody's listings at once, joined by about 10 million new magazines doing the exact same thing with almost no flair whatsoever, printed on toilet paper and sold for pennies. Consequently, this thing was absolutely colossal. At least it seemed so at the time. They would only keep getting bigger. Compared to this year's issue, it's a pamphlet. 1992's cover repeated the basic formula of a Christmas card styled painting, this time with a snowman rather than Father Christmas, who again looks rather untrustworthy to me with his dead eyes. Another brief tradition flares up here in the shape of a little bubble in the corner bragging about the sheer number of films that will be on over the Christmas fortnight. This issue has 500 of the damn things. Watch that number rise. Eeriest of all was 1993's entry, depicting an Alfred E. Newman-alike rapscallywag missing his two front teeth, because obviously everyone in the world finds that song charming. Well, the artist does, presumably. 700 films this year. In 1994, oh hey, I remember you. Would have been more appropriate for the magazine's 70th anniversary the previous year, but still, it's nice to see Abby's Family again, albeit in a redrawn version, mostly to remove the smoking. Bloody nanny state causing a TV listings magazine to decide entirely of its own volition to refrain from promoting the profitless inhalation of burning carcinogens on the cover of their own magazine, which will be viewed by the entire family unit for over a fortnight. Its basic concern for human health gone perfectly reasonable. You'll notice the logo has gone through its first major alteration in over 2 decades, having been apparently fattened up for market. No change in the number of movies, 700 again. In contrast, 1995 boasts so many movies they've actually made it the theme of the cover, with yet another beautifully rendered Royal Dalton-esque Santa waving a clapperboard around to no great effect. It also mentions Barry Normal's Plums and Turkeys, which ran for several years in the 90s, in which the pickled onion magnate and former Channel 4 Olympics host went through the biggest movies on television over the season, made all the most predictably contrarian observations about them, and lamented the use of the word turkey as a slur on a magnificent bird every bloody year without fail. 1996 was a bit manic, with a Jack-in-the-Box snowman leaping through his own wrapping, clutching a copy of the very magazine that depicts him doing so. By now I was just about old enough to cope with that sort of thing, however. I like the attention to detail with the little Yule log twig eyebrows. 800 plus movies this year. 1997 is another one of my favourites, because while still essentially just a facial close-up of Mr. S. Claus, it eschews the normal Thomas Kincaid / Quality Street style, in favour of something a little bit more stylised, angular and dynamic. No brag about a buttload of movies, but next year's would make up for it. 1998 was also the first of a new subgenre, the bloody weird cover. They seem to have handed out the brief of a movie-related Christmas painting, but the artist has taken it in interesting and perhaps unanticipated directions. Father Christmas with a sheriff's badge, riding a reindeer and wielding a lasso, apparently on the basis that a western is a kind of movie. 1,000 of the damn things on this time, so knock yourselves out. 1999 was of course the turn of the millennium, and saw the last real major starring role for anything vaguely Judeo-Christian on any of these covers. And even this isn't a real angel. 2000 was the year Harry Potter became properly massive, with the publication of Goblet of Fire. He had Radio 4 practically to himself on Boxing Day with an uninterrupted 8-hour broadcast of the audiobook of Philosopher's Stone, as read by Stephen Fry. To celebrate, Radio Times put him on the cover. This led to a spate of newspaper puff pieces insisting that the BBC, who actually had very little to do with making the magazine at this point, had dropped Santa Claus from the cover for the very first time in all of history. Of course, it wasn't even the first time in recent memory, unless you were born during 2000 itself, because he was on the previous year's cover. And either way, it was staggeringly unimportant. But it filled up space in the colour supplement, and ultimately, that's what matters. 2001 was another bloody weird one, and in fact kicked off a brief run of them, with this image of a woman in a completely impractical Christmas tree outfit, complete with dangling presents for petticoats. By now, the famous Caslon logo had finally been retired altogether, in favour of crispy Gill Sans Bold. And after having stalled at around 1,000 for a few years, the rise of digital has led to a positive surge in the number of movies on over the fortnight, to a grand total of 1,750 plus. Father Christmas was back in 2002, but the fevered imagination of the artist saw him reduced to a right tiny jolly old elf riding a robin redbreast. Although I'm not actually sure how scale is supposed to work in this picture. Maybe it's a average size Father Christmas on a gigantic monster robin redbreast. Don't hang around underneath it. Meanwhile, the movies have broken 2,000. 2003 gave us a slightly nightmarish Matryoshka doll's house, which judging by the backdrop must be the size of an actual house, unless again there's some severe foreshortening going on. The more you look at it, the less sense it makes. Magritte almost might have come up with it. 2004 effectively ended this run of oddity, with Father Christmas this time flying a toy plane, accompanied by one of his reindeer, around a gigantic Christmas pudding planetoid with cream in the shape of the British Isles. What makes you think I know? Confusing but charming, this cover was also the last to openly brag about the number of movies mentioned therein, it having become increasingly redundant over the years as more and more people switched to digital television and experienced 10 billion identical movie channels for themselves. It just wasn't special anymore. 2005 saw a further and to date final alteration to the logo, and the first Christmas cover to be dominated by a specific television programme since Carols from Kings all the way back in 1989. Then it was the BBC's biggest show of the year. Inevitably, there were more puff pieces written by imbeciles for the benefit of morons about the axing of Father Christmas, no one really paid any attention. Besides, the fat man was back with pride of place the following year, with this rather sweet little image. Unfortunately, this was also the first time the Radio Times self-described their Christmas issue as legendary, which they've done to a greater or lesser extent every year since, and which is a mistake. Not that it's factually incorrect, as evidenced by the fact that I've now spent over half an hour solidly talking about it. But to ascribe legendary status to yourself is the most obnoxious thing anyone can do, short of be Jim Davidson. Mr. S. Claus was back again in 2007 in a heartwarmingly silly scene that deceptively saved the magazine a lot of printer ink. He made way in 2008 for the nation's favourite crackpot inventor and dog, Wallace and Gromit, who were celebrating the release of their first new short in 12 years. Note the use once again of the mirror-in-mirror effect. This being Wallace and Gromit, I'm assuming he accidentally invented a time machine of some sort. 2009's one featured for the first time variant covers symbolising the BBC's two big Christmas Day draws. There was a vaguely Strictly Come Dancing related one, and a more on-the-nose Doctor Who one with a movie vintage Dalek, to mark the departure of David Tennant. In 2010, Wallace and Gromit came back for no apparent reason whatsoever, as this time they didn't have a new show to promote. This was effectively an act of self-plagiarism, born one hopes out of desperation rather than diminishing interest. 2011's was much better, perhaps the last truly creative Christmas Radio Times cover to date. Again coming in multiple variations, and entirely hand-drawn and lettered even down to the logo by Kate Forrester, presumably the black sheep of the Forrester family. This was the first post-BBC Christmas Radio Times, as the corporation divested itself of most of its magazines that year. It's now published by a company called Immediate Media, and they hit their first classic Christmas cover the first time out at bat. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for the second. 2012 saw the anniversary of The Snowman, and the broadcast of its successor, The Snowman and the Snow Dog, so it was a no-brainer to put the Raymond Briggs characters on the cover, albeit not drawn by the increasingly ancient Briggs himself. And it is a nice cover. When they put essentially the same thing on the following year's cover, however, it was less forgivable, despite the undoubted quality of the image itself. Two things rubbed salt in the wound, apart from the fact that the Radio Times was promoting a repeat. For a start, this was the magazine's 90th anniversary year, the perfect opportunity to break out another homage to Abbey, or Edward McKnight Calfo, or anyone, instead of just recycling the previous year's theme and style. For a second, the eminent cartoonist Stephen Collins submitted this, and they turned it down, although they did use it as an advert. You people know better than that. Last year they hired someone genuinely legendary, the children's author and illustrator Judith Kerr, born the same year as the Radio Times. This year it's Aardman again, this time with Shaun the Sheep. Both good, but not 1984 good. I'm not, however, going to sit here and claim that the more recent covers have betrayed any kind of tradition, because there is no tradition. Or rather, there's several. The magazine's history is too vast to contain just the one. It's been going on for 92 years and counting. Loads of traditions have come and gone over that time, from avant-garde abstraction to staged photography, to commemorative plate art, to claymation sculpture. I'm hoping the next trend involves neo-futurist expressionism. Or maybe avant-garde tinsel minimalism. Just don't hire the Chapman brothers, whatever you do.
Some good stuff on the telly, Del.
Yeah, I know. It's really great. Wait, hey, go and get your own copy of the double-issue Christmas Radio Times. It's got a lovely picture on the front. Touch of class this year. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.